And that was the reminder for me to tell everybody that this meeting is being recorded. So this will be recorded and posted. It's only the speakers and who are in sight of the recording, but I did want to let you know. So just a little bit of background before I pass this over to my colleague Tara. This is a joint seminar between the Institute of Sustainability and Resilience and the Center for Pacific Island Studies. For those of you who aren't familiar with ISR, it's a relatively recent institute that operates within the Office of the Provost at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, whereas CPIS is celebrating their 70th year this year, so that's very exciting. And ISR, we partner every year with we have a new partnership each year to deliver topics in sustainability and resilience. And this year, the topic is the Resilient Pacific. So the seminar series that we are going to deliver this year really is going to focus on the many ways that Pacific communities develop capacity to overcome a variety of challenges. So we'll talk about climate change issues, health issues, right? And really pushing forward conceptualizing sustainability and sustainable futures. So before I move on, I also just really want to thank James Viernes and Aida Arik from CPIS and ISR for really pulling this together, and in particular, helping overcome some of these IT challenges and getting the webinar set up. So thank you, James and Aida. And with that, I will introduce our kickoff speaker. So very happy that Tarsisius Kapitulaka will be starting our seminar. Tara is the director of CPIS, as well as an associate professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His background is as a political scientist, and his research interests are in geopolitics, international interventions, regionalism, governance, natural resources and economic development, and political developments in Oceania. So Tara is going to be talking about COVID-19 and restoring economic development in the Pacific Islands. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Tara. Thank you.
Thank you, McKenna, and thank you again to James and Aida for organizing this. Thank you also to the people who have joined us. We are indeed honored to have you for this first in a series on Pacific resilience. I am honored to be the first speaker, and hopefully, set the ball rolling for others who will come after me and do a wonderful job, much better than me. Many of the ideas that I will be sharing today are preliminary. So I want us to see this as planting the ideas for a conversation. And what I want to do is to tell you a story. Once upon a time, long ago, in a faraway land beyond our ocean, and long before COVID-19, an idea was born. The baby idea was wrapped in layers of assumptions about the goals and trajectories of human civilization and who dictates them. The newborn idea was said to be the Messiah that will take human societies to an utopian salvation of high living standards, high per capita income, increased productive capacity, humans' mastery over nature, economic growth, the elimination of poverty, and the satisfaction of basic needs. The idea was baptized with the name economic development. And since its birth, economic development has reincarnated in various forms, depending on the storytellers that have told the stories over time. An earlier form focused on its role in enabling and explaining humans' transformation of nature, like the conversion of land into cities, roads, plantations, mines, and so on. These were regarded as developments because they transformed nature into something that can be used by humans, or made nature accessible to humans, and a demonstration of humans' mastery over it. Consequently, when Europeans pioneers landed in the new world of what later became the US and cleared the land, built settlements, cultivated food, and raised livestock, similar things happened in Australia and New Zealand. That was regarded as development. This is despite the fact that Native Americans, Australian Aborigines, and Maoris have long lived in these places and have themselves transformed landscapes and become part of them. This was for a long time the general understanding of development. The contemporary incarnation of economic development is relatively new, becoming prominent after World War II. The victors of the war came out with not just a victory trumpet, but also a self-proclaimed global leadership role, not only as a military power, but also as an economic and moral leaders. And who would have doubted them? They had won the war, and through the Marshall Plan were able to help Western Europe recover quite rapidly from the destructions of the war. So after the war, they set out to do a number of things that still have profound impact on the entire world. First, they set up international institutions that not only regulate international relations, but also set values that have now become universalized. These were said to include even parts of the world that have never heard of these institutions or their goals. Second, they put in place an economic development model that would have profound global impact, not only because of its economic activities and outcomes, but also because of the cultures and values that it espouses. And third, in response to the post-World War II demands for decolonization, the colonial powers relinquished their territories and accorded them constitutional independence, enabling them to form nation states and claim sovereignty over defined territories. But many of these newly independent countries mirrored the former colonial powers in terms of their political and economic systems, joining a queue of countries on the voyage towards economic growth. And fourth, they set out to draw an economic map of the world. These designated countries and entire regions into economic categories. So let me take us back to the cold winter day of 20 January 1949, when the then President Harry Truman gave his inaugural speech before Congress in Washington, D.C. In that speech, he defined a large part of the world as underdeveloped. In an utterance, and I quote, "There was suddenly a permanent feature of the landscape, a pivotal concept which crammed the immeasurable diversity of the globe's south into a single category, underdeveloped." This was not just an economic mapping of geographical spaces, but also a mapping of the trajectories of human civilization, that all human societies should voyage on a single destination towards development. To President Truman, the star that will guide humans to this destination was clear. And I quote what Truman said, quote, "Greater production in the key to prosperity and peace. The world has become an economic arena, and the US and its Western European allies, plus Australia and New Zealand, saw themselves as the lead canoes in this development voyage. And if the rest of the world were to keep their eye on them and avoid the currents of economic mismanagement, they would eventually reach the destination. By the 1950s, other characters helped define the course towards economic development. One of these was Walt Whitman Rostro, the economist who was credited for mapping the 5 stages of economic growth, from traditional societies to high mass consumption society, or the state of developedness. And central to the idea of development is economic growth, as measured by gross domestic product. This was and still is seen as the goal. If we accumulate enough financial capital and are able to distribute it equitably, then it would lead to prosperity. Consequently, there was a frenzy to accumulate, not only by states, but also by corporate entities. In fact, the reorganization of societies into the money economy was conducted like a moral crusade. And therein lies the challenge. Not every country has the capacity or the means to accumulate financial capital. Second, not everyone is willing to distribute wealth equitably, even when they have accumulated it. It is a hugely destructive set of ideas because its logic is one of wholesale transformation rather than adaptation or incorporation of appropriate institutions, practices, and values and lifestyles. It asks individuals and societies to stop being what they are and have been and become something completely different. By the late 1960s, we began to see the problems with the idea that economic growth will lead to social progress. In 1973, Robert McNamara, the president of the World Bank, summed up the state of affairs, and I quote, "Despite a decade of unprecedented increase in gross national product, the poorest segments of the population have received relatively little benefit. The upper 40% of the population typically receives 75% of all income. And despite these financial institutions, such as the World Bank, continue to promote this development model, part of the reason is not economics, but an assumption of moral superiority on the part of the Western countries that control the financial institutions." So how does Oceania? Much of Oceania became part of the global economy in the 1800s, first as transshipment points for trade between Asia and the Americas and Europe. Guam was an exception. It has been important to the Spanish since the 1600s, and then to the US since 1898. And so by the 1800s, some Pacific islands became sources of natural resources such as sandalwood and beech demar, harvested by Euro-American entrepreneurs to meet the demands in Asia. Some became sites for the establishment of plantations. Hawaii, Fiji, and the Northern Marianas hosted sugarcane plantations, while coconut plantations were established in other islands. In the early 1900s, as agriculture industries in metropolitan countries needed fertilizer, phosphate mines were established in several islands, including Banaba in present-day Kiribati, Nauru, Makatea in French Polynesia, Angao in Palau. Pacific Islanders were also used as laborers in whaling ships, plantations, mines, and so on. In some cases, they were forcefully taken as laborers, like the blackbirding scheme that saw Melanesians taken to work in sugarcane plantations and coconut plantations in Australia, Fiji, and Samoa, or Tuvaluans, Tokelauans, and Kiribati in mines in Peru. So by the onset of World War II, many Pacific Island places and people had had some degree of influence from the global money economy. However, the economies of the islands focused largely on the costs of meeting colonial bureaucracies and facilitating the exploitation of natural resources, predominantly by companies from the colonial powers. That continued after World War II. Decolonization did not reach Oceania until the 1960s, and for most countries, the 1970s and 80s. Nauru gained independence in 1968, Samoa in 1962. But Nauru inherited an economy with one of the highest GDP per capita in the world because of income from phosphate mining and a relatively small population. Of course, Nauru's story has changed since then. Others inherited economies that were small and narrow-based, often dependent on plantations and a few other industries. The economies are often described by donors and development partners and financial institutions as small, weak, and vulnerable because of their dependence on a few export commodities and their isolation from major markets, which means high cost of trade. They did not have economies of scale. Many Pacific Islands were often described as having mirab economies, an economy that's dependent on migration, remittances, aid, and bureaucracies. Despite these economic predicaments, these newly independent island states were thrown into the post-Second World War global economic system and were expected to have the same destination and navigational path. They were expected to grow and to one day reach the utopian destination of becoming a high mass consumption societies. Development partners and international financial institutions constantly remind them of their lack of growth and low GDP per capita. They provide recommendations on the kinds of sails to use for this economic voyaging canoe, but kept them locked on the economic growth course and the destination, the island of mass consumption society. In the early days of that journey, a significant percentage of island countries' population depended on subsistence sector, which is still the case in some countries, especially the Melanesian countries of Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, and to a certain extent, Fiji. But the subsistence sector is often not accounted for in the economic data or measurements of livelihood. Over time, the subsistence sector became untenable, partly because of a growing population and limited land resources, but also because of an economic system that values and rewards participation in the efforts to grow the economy or economic growth. This is complemented by an education system that trains people for jobs in the money economy, jobs that many times do not exist. And so by the time COVID-19 pandemic arrived, the economy of many Pacific Island countries was in some ways different from what it was 20 years ago. For example, exports had increased by about 169%. This was largely evident for the larger countries like Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and Solomon Islands. The US and French territories' economies are hugely subsidized by the metropolitan powers. Pacific Islands economies have become much more integrated into the global economy than ever before. But in other ways, they were very similar to 20 years ago. Still aid dependent, narrow-based, relatively isolated, and from the centers of major markets. COVID-19, as we all know, is a global crisis that affects all of us, whether you live in New York or in San Francisco or in a rural village in the Pacific Islands. However, the nature and intensity and scale of the impacts vary. Apart from its health impact, the pandemic has engendered a global economic recession. Trade is expected to fall by between 13% and 32% in 2020 as normal life and economic activities are disrupted. Millions of jobs will be lost worldwide. This is therefore not just a health crisis, it is also an economic and labor market crisis. The pandemic caught many countries with their proverbial pants down. exposing flaws and vulnerabilities of modern civilization, especially the ideologies and structures that have long influenced human imagination, aspiration, and the ways in which the world is organized. Central to this is the idea of economic development, especially the idea of economic development that normalizes our insatiable addiction to infinite growth that is built on an unbridled extraction and destruction of natural resources. In our quest for economic growth, we are destroying our environment and planet. We have arrogantly asserted ourselves as the masters of the planet rather than belonging to and being part of it. We have been terrible citizens of Earth. Although we consider ourselves as the most intelligent residents of this planet, it is obvious that we do not fully understand nature's powers and when and how it can be unleashed. The pandemic also exposed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of global interconnections. On one hand, it shows that humanity's collective effort to address the crisis is our best option. On the other hand, it highlights how places at the margins of state and global influence are now being seen as the safest during the pandemic. As of now, 12 countries do not have confirmed cases of coronavirus, or at least they have not declared positive cases of coronavirus. Out of those 12 countries, 10 of them are Pacific Island countries, and they include Nauru, Tuvalu, Palau, the Marshall Islands, Tonga, the Federated States of Micronesia, Kiribati, Samoa, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands. The island countries' defense against the virus was their geographical status as islands, which isolates them from large populations, major migration routes, and the centers of global trade. These were characteristics that were often identified as the causes of their economic vulnerabilities. Now they have become their fortress during this pandemic. In many of the Pacific Island countries, people, as a response to the COVID-19, people were encouraged to return to their rural home villages and practice subsistence agriculture. In Solomon Islands, for example, the government declared a state of emergency in late March 2020 and provided funding to charter ships to take people back to their villages, triggering mass migration from the national capital, Honiara, to rural areas as people attempt to escape the virus. Villages were portrayed as safe havens because of their relative isolation. It is ironic that after decades of promoting global interconnection, we are now seeking refuge in places as isolated as possible from the rest of the world. But these are also places where social services such as health and education are at best inadequate and at worst non-existent. Island countries like the Marshall Islands, Samoa, and Vanuatu were amongst the first to stop international flights and shipping. Many remain closed today, except for flights to repatriate citizens stranded overseas. This was an attempt to stop the coronavirus from reaching their shores. The island countries were practicing what I call island distancing, a form of social distancing. The impacts on island economies have been devastating. Shrinking global demands and drop in commodity prices has affected island countries like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Fiji, and so on, that are dependent on commodity exports. The tourism industry was one of the most hardest hit and countries such as Fiji, Palau, Vanuatu, Samoa, and the Cook Islands were amongst the countries most affected. The graph that we have on is not very clear, but what it does show is the difference between, so the one at the top focuses on the jobs that the tourism industry provides. That's the gray charts over there. And then the one at the bottom shows the negative growth that is predicted as a result of COVID-19. Flights were shut down and tourists were staying away. Public debts are increasing in the Pacific Islands as well as a result of this. These are compounded by natural disasters, such as Cyclone Harold, which hit Vanuatu, Tonga, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands in April 2020. There have been diverse responses amongst Pacific Island countries and peoples to COVID-19 and the economic crisis. For governments, the push has largely been to find ways to restore the economy to the way it was prior to COVID-19. There have been talks about establishing economic bubbles, like the proposal for a trans-Tasman bubble between Australia and New Zealand. Fiji was trying to be part of that bubble. However, that has burst because of the new COVID-19 cases in New Zealand and increasing cases in Australia, especially in the state of Victoria. There were also talks about travel bubble between COVID-19 negative countries in the Pacific. That was not seriously pursued because of the uncertainties about its economic value. Much of the bubble talk has been about restoring the economy to the way it was. The second conversation that is going on centers around the fact that the pandemic has given us the opportunity to reflect, to learn, and make some fundamental changes to not only the ways in which we do things, but also the ideas that inform them. This is a conversation about creating new normals, new realities. And central to this discussion is the need to rethink economic development and ask if the development trajectories that Pacific Island countries and peoples want or can afford. We must use this opportunity to proactively rethink and reset our development agendas, our values, goals, and processes and trajectories. However, in these discussions, the multi-million-dollar questions are, one, what does the new development approach look like? And second, how feasible is this in an era when Pacific Islands are intricately interconnected with the global system? And three, how will it help states pay for social services such as education, health, infrastructure development, and so forth? And four, how will it provide income for ordinary people? I do not have answers to these questions, but these are questions worth engaging in our discussions about sustainability and resilience. I acknowledge that taking countries off the economic growth path is like trying to wrestle with a whale. But here are some thoughts. First, the idea of a well-being budget. Last year, Aotearoa, New Zealand passed the Wellbeing Budget 2019-2020, which is based on gauging the long-term impacts of policies on people's well-being rather than on short-term measures. Of course, Aotearoa is different from the smaller Pacific Island countries, but the idea that informed the Wellbeing Budget could be used in our discussions. And it is there, if there are lessons to learn from it. The other example is Vanuatu, which is trying similar endeavors as well. The other thing that I want us to think about is what I call relational economy. We need an economic system that emphasizes and gives values to relationships between people, person to person, and between people and environment, or people, person to nature. The person-to-person relationship could be the foundation of what the Tongan scholar Kaitu Ipangai Funaki refers to as the gross national generosity. In the midst of COVID-19 pandemic and its negative impact on the economy, and with people losing jobs, a movement called Barter for Better Fiji started in Fiji. Social media was used to facilitate a barter system where people exchange goods and services without cash transactions. A private doctor in Nandi dropped cash fees and switched to a bartering for medical services. The Barter for Better Fiji has its challenges, and while it gives value to the goods exchange, it also centers the generosities and relationships that come with bartering. And so economies that encourage relationships between people and also between people and the environment. Now, one could argue that modern economic system is also based on relationships, trade relationships, for instance. That is true. But central to this is the person-to-thing relationship and the emphasis on growth, focus on accumulating goods, including money. In thinking through what kind of economic system would be feasible for Pacific Island places in the face of COVID-19, I think at the center of this discussion is education. How do we begin to change ideas and mindsets about economic development? Education is foundational to addressing this issue, that there is a need to review curriculums and pedagogies to train people to value different things. And these discussions are not about trying to isolate Pacific Islands and countries and people from the rest of the world. That is impossible. Rather, it is about looking for and creating new kinds of relationships, new kinds of relationships that value different things. This is not going to be easy, but it is time to restore Pacific Islands economic development if we are going to build a resilient Pacific. Thank you. And I just want to leave you with a cartoon that I drew some years ago, 2006, I think. And it has Pacific Islanders and different people telling them which arrow to follow to the development goal. Thank you. Makena.
Thank you, Tara. That was a great talk. And I put this in the chat, but I wanted just to reiterate it. Please send in your questions for Tara via the chat, and he can start. We have some time left for discussion, so please just start typing them in. And I'll kick off with a question, Tara. So your description of people being sent to the rural areas, right, after decades of pressure to move to more urban areas in COVID was really interesting to me. And I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on what you see as the meaningful role for subsistence in Pacific Island countries moving forward, even in a post-COVID world, and how that might differ across the Pacific.
Yeah, and also I think, thank you, Makena. I think it's also important to note that this differs in different parts of the Pacific, and for a number of reasons. So in some Pacific Island places, there is a large subsistence population that's not often accounted for in the development data, as I mentioned earlier on. And in the face of COVID-19, I think there is and if you look at, throughout the region, a lot of people have been not only encouraging each other, but also been engaged in planting food for themselves. But there's a challenge to that. The challenge is that not everybody has access to land in the same way. And so while it's possible for people who do have access to land, it's difficult for those who don't. And a large percentage of those who don't have access to land are in urban areas, people who have moved into cities and who suffer from, modern poverty in that they are deprived of land. They often do not have access to proper housing and so live in squatter settlements. But also in the smaller island countries like Kiribati or Tuvalu or other atoll places, land is a scarce resource. And so whilst it is true that subsistence sector can play an important role, it is also true that that is not possible throughout the Pacific. I wonder if that answers your question now.
Yeah, no, it does. It sort of helps me put it in context. And you have quite a number of questions coming through the chat.
So one of the questions here is, what island nations, if any, are leading in coming back economically, and if any, why? So as far as I know, a lot of the Pacific Island countries at the moment are just struggling to avoid COVID-19, except for places like Fiji and Papua New Guinea, who already have cases. And of course, Guam is the other Pacific Island place with huge cases. And so a lot of the discussions about economics development is now internal, about trying to see how they can improve the domestic economy. In some places, governments have injected money into the economy to try and encourage people or farmers or others to plant. And in terms of successful stories, at the moment it's too early, and I not that I know of any specific places. Okay, there's a question, there's a statement from Terence asking, please comment on the role of overseas migration in the post-COVID Pacific. The post-COVID Pacific. So, Terence, if I understand your question correctly, what you was asking is, after COVID-19 is over, what would that mean for overseas, for people migrating out? I'll come back to you later. And if you can clarify a little bit more, that'll be great. Okay, there is a statement by Margot about the possibility of being less dependent on outside goods. That's something that is a huge. So COVID-19 is not only the health challenge that Pacific Island countries face. Other health issues are also important, particularly those related to lifestyle, and so dependent on outside food, for instance. But again, whilst that is something that a lot of Pacific Island countries aspire to, their ability to produce food domestically is also limited, and especially for the small island places. But for countries like Papua New Guinea, for instance, or Fiji to a certain extent, and Solomon Islands or Vanuatu, I think there is capacity to produce food domestically. The highlands of Papua New Guinea is a huge agricultural area. But I'm not certain I can say the same story for places like Nauru or Kiribati or the smaller places in the Micronesian countries. Palau can sustain a population of about 20,000 people. Okay.
Tara, there are also some questions coming in the Q&A. So there's the chat and the Q&A. I think it's, anyways, I'm posting them from the Q&A into the chat so you can see them all in one place.
Okay. What is the wealth gap? There's a question about wealth gap in Pacific Island countries. Again, it varies in different countries. If you look at the French territories or the US territories, their economies are highly subsidized by the metropolitan countries. But then if you look at other countries where you do not have that kind of subsidy, there is huge economic gap. Okay. Okay, there is a question about Hawaii's response to our Pacific Islander community. So those of you who are not from Hawaii probably don't know, maybe you know, that one of the most affected population in the case of Hawaii are Pacific Islanders in terms of per capita. Smaller population, but higher infection rates. And the question that Terence is asking is, why is it that the state of Hawaii has failed in addressing this? I think there is awareness of the problem, but this is not just a health issue, it is also a socio-economic issue. That a lot of these people, Pacific Islanders, have jobs that expose them to infections, or they hold jobs that put them in places that make it likely for them to be infected. A lot of them also live in houses with intergenerational houses with a lot of people and in small spaces. And so it's an economic issue as well. And I suppose, for the state of Hawaii, addressing this immediate health problem at the moment will also ask us to address socio-economic issues in the longer term as well, not only for Pacific Islanders, but for other populations at the margins of the economy. So another one from Terence to all the panelists. Some countries rely heavily on remittances, and those funds have been reduced because of economic distress in places. So this is also an opportunity for Pacific Islands that, as a result of the COVID-19 and as a result of economic crisis in the donor countries, there's a likelihood to see a decline in the kind of money that comes into the Pacific places. But it also gives an opportunity for Pacific Island countries to see how they can survive without these funds that they have depended on for a long time. And I think Terence's question focuses particularly on remittances, that, the money places where you send money to Solomon Islands or Samoa or Tonga or other places have closed, or, because people are no longer working in New Zealand, Australia, or the US, they can no longer send money home. And so there's a decline in the remittances that's going back to these places. And that has real impact on people's lives, and I cannot deny that, because there are populations that depend on this money. But at the same time, it gives people an opportunity to relook at other ways of surviving in these countries. There is a question about the status of healthcare services and availability across the Pacific. Again, it varies in different parts of the Pacific, but by and large, I think, for a lot of Pacific Island places, if they do get COVID-19 infection, their ability to be able to contain it is very limited, if not non-existent. Papua New Guinea is an example of this. Papua New Guinea has had COVID-19 cases, and one of their biggest concerns is their ability, the capacity of their health services. Same with places like Solomon Islands. Even places like Guam that has relatively better health services than a lot of Pacific Island countries, with the increasing cases, that has also been an issue of concern. And so, for a lot of Pacific Island countries, the reason why they're trying as much as possible to ensure that they do not have positive COVID-19 cases is because they are really aware of the inability of their health system to cope with increased infections. So there's a question from Terence, and Foley, I'll come back to your question. Sorry, from Scott, which is asking, and Scott is asking, how can institutions like CIPIS or UH and the East-West Center support efforts in the Pacific Islands to rethink their development approaches and priorities? So just to let people aware that there has been a lot of discussion going on amongst Pacific Islanders about this. I have been part of discussions that have been going on for months. So people are proactively trying to rethink what can we do. And a lot of these discussions at the moment are taking place online through Zoom mostly. And they include people in Australia and New Zealand and Pacific Islands. And in some cases, the discussions have also included Pacific Island government leaders as well. I think the role of institutions like UH, CIPIS, or in particular, or East-West Center, or other institutions, is to facilitate that kind of discussion, to bring it together. In one of the talanoas that I've been part of, it's unrecorded. It's people getting together and just talking stories. A lot of time people have Zoom cover and then talk to each other about the challenges that we face. And that's wonderful because ideas are generated in those discussions. But at some stage down the road, we need to begin to pool those ideas together. Excuse me. And I think that that's a role that institutions such as the East-West Center or UH can play. So Foley, I think your question in a way answers itself. You were saying that you were hoping that reorienting towards relationships may provide opportunities for addressing the harms of historical extraction, colonialism, climate change, and so forth. And I think you're absolutely right that this will get us to focus on looking at the kinds of relationships that existed in the past and to a certain extent contributed to some of the challenges that we have. Places like, actually throughout the Pacific Islands, but places like Nauru, the kinds of relationships that existed and therefore affected Nauru over the years, particularly in the post-phosphate mining period. So there is a question about, Pacific Island governments encouraging traditional money such as shell money, pig task, and so forth as the mainstream of market, into mainstream market economy. I have not seen that in most Pacific Island places. I think, governments often focus on trying to build a money economy, a cash economy that would enable them to provide the kinds of services that would give them legitimacy. And so health services, education, and so forth. However, having said that, I should mention the idea of the custom bank in Vanuatu, where people deposit in these banks things like pig task or mats, and then when you need to borrow that, you go to the custom bank and borrow it and then repay it with interest. So if you take pig task, you repay it with the extra pig task. And so you have that circulating in what is often regarded as the traditional economy. And perhaps that's an idea that we might want to see in other Pacific Island places as well, Tapa or Tambua in the case of Fiji, or Fine Mat in Samoa, and creating an economy that not only gives people the ability to use those things in relationships, in death or wedding or in relationships, but also preserves that economy as well. So related to that is a question: how can traditional economy work harmoniously with the caste economy during the COVID-19 era? I suppose one could look at the Barter for Better Fiji as an example of that, that people, so the barter system has existed in a lot of our societies for a very long time. And one could see the barter system as a form of economy, that people exchange not only goods, but people in the process build personal relationships with each other. For instance, this doctor in Nandi that, came out saying that, for those who cannot afford to pay cash for the services that he provides, he will accept taro or yangona or whatever that they can bring. And so that, I think, is an example of a traditional economy working in the face of COVID-19. It has the challenges because in some cases, people are exchanging their taro for canned tuna, for instance. And therefore it raises issues about other health problems that the kind of food that people are exchanging for will cause. And there are challenges in that some people do not have access to land to be able to plant and produce the things that they need to butter. And sometimes people look through their homes and see things that they haven't used for a long time and exchange that as well. And so I think that's an example of a traditional economy in a way working alongside other economies or the formal economy during COVID-19. So Margot again raised the question of whether the pandemic will serve to strengthen the cultural traditions in Pacific that are based on cooperation, sharing, and extended family ties. I really do hope so. I really hope that Pacific Islanders, in reflecting on this, realize that there are important things in life like relationships that are important and a part of our economic system. And I do hope that Pacific Islanders will think, and I think to a certain extent they do. And Pacific Islanders have become more individualistic in recent times. Will this present situation to make them rethink? I do hope so, Margot, that that will be the case. So there is an issue about Australia have shared on media that upon the arrival of a vaccine, they will be doing their part to getting their neighboring island nations vaccinated in light of autonomies and relational economies. Good idea or not upon Australia's part? Yes, I mean any assistance from places like Australia would be welcome in a lot of Pacific Island places, and particularly in relation to a vaccine. But at the same time, there is a need to be conscious of the geopolitical positions and issues that arise out of this as well. Australia has always been an important neighbor to Pacific Island countries, but has also been a dominant neighbor as well. And there are geopolitical issues that I am sure will factor in the discussions about what kind of role Australia could play. Okay, there's another. Yeah, there is a question about barter for Fiji, and you know, I'm learning as much as possible from the online website, and you're right that, you know, in a way, the barter for Fiji also focuses on transactive relationship, that you give me something and I give you something in return. But I'm hoping that because of uh, I'm hoping that because of the situation that people are in, that these would lead on to actual better relationship between people who are bartering things with each other, that you get to know the people that you are exchanging goods with. You're not just interested in the commodity or the goods that you're exchanging, but you are also interested in the relationships that come about as a result of that. So I'm hoping that that's going to be the case. But again, you know, as I mentioned earlier on, this was something that just came out, and you know, somebody in Fiji came up with the idea, put it out, and it seemed to have taken a life of its own. I'm sure similar things are happening in other Pacific Island countries, but haven't been Fiji. Okay, that's the questions I can see.
Thank you so much, Tara.
McKenna.
I just want to really send my words of appreciation for a wonderful talk and for kicking off our joint seminar series. So, and thank you for all of you for joining us and sending in such great questions. So we're learning about sort of the Zoom webinar functions and how they work, but I think that went pretty smoothly. There was a question about whether the video recording will be posted. And the answer is yes, we're working on it. Hopefully it'll be on the ISR website. And I think also James is working on a link to the CPIS social media or website. And before we sign off, I just want to give a preview for next week's talk. So really happy to say that we're gonna have Eleanor Sterling and Pua'ala Pasqua join us from the American Museum of Natural History. And they'll be talking about when global sustainability goals meet local actions, a case study and lessons learned exploring multidimensional well-being in the Pacific Islands. So I'm looking forward to that too. Tara, do you have any last words?
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you for having me. And I actually look forward to the wonderful speakers who will be coming after me until the end of the year. So please, I encourage people to come and join us.
Absolutely. So Tara and I will be sort of taking turns moderating for the semester and for our shared seminar series. So we'll see you again, hopefully. Thank you, everybody. Mahalo. Take care.